The big challenge for us is going to be around making what we do as safe as we possibly can. One of the things that you can do to make the job safe is to stop putting people offshore. I think, things like improved connectivity to the turbines, better AI systems, use of remotely operated, whether it's vessels or submarine vehicles or drones, all of those things can hopefully help fix some of the problems that we're likely to see on turbines over the next 25, 30 years.
Hello and welcome back to the Hypercube Podcast. I'm joined today here in sunny Glasgow by Gary Connolly, who is Head of UK Offshore Wind Development for ESB Energy. Gary, thank you for joining us here. I hope the trains over from Edinburgh this morning weren't too bad. If you could do us the pleasure of introducing yourself, ESB, and what you've been up to.
Okay, as you say, Adam, my name is Gary Connolly. My responsibility is looking after our offshore wind activities in the UK. We're an Irish utility company. We're the biggest utility that exists in Ireland. We're well known in Ireland. We're less well known elsewhere. So we still are government owned. We're a semi-state company, which is relatively unusual. And up until deregulation, we basically owned the network, all the generation and all the customer supply. So it was the traditional monopoly. And then that changed, obviously, in the 90s. And so now we're restricted from a regulation point of view in the context of how much electricity we can generate in Ireland, how much we can supply. We still own all the wires, but it's a ring-fenced company that exists outside the kind of the broader ESB group, if you want to call it that.
What's the any old timers like the verdict, or is it better or worse? Like internally, not much nicer to be a monopoly, or?
So I've only ever known it as effectively a commercial company, and there's still people retiring who would have known it as being as an old traditional monopoly, and they'll have the old tear in their eyes and say things were better in the old days. But I think in practical terms it means as an organisation we're just much sharper and better at what we do. I think because that's what happens when you have competition.
So. You personally, I think when we last spoke, you've got an agricultural engineering background. What brought you from sort of energy and or from agriculture, farmland through to the energy sector and that journey?
That's a really good question. So I worked for an organisation called CAFRE, College of Agriculture, Food and Rural Enterprise in Northern Ireland, and it's kind of the equivalent of the Scottish Agricultural Colleges or some of the other organisations that exist in the UK. And our responsibility as an entity was around providing education, but also technical advice to farmers and certainly technology transfer to farmers. From my point of view in the engineering space, we did all sorts of weird and wonderful things like precision agriculture and guidance systems and all the stuff that's actually come to the fore now, 20 plus years later. But the thing that was really coming to the fore in my time in the Department of Agriculture was on-farm energy production. So I was involved in onshore wind, small-scale farm, biodiesel, biomass heating systems, a wee bit of hydro. So all that kind of stuff farmers were interested in. So there was a reasonably long and natural progression from being involved in what you might call traditional agricultural engineering into energy engineering with an agricultural bent. And that's how then ultimately there was a shift from working for the Department of Agriculture, as they were, to what is ESB now.
It makes me think years ago, I was talking to someone who was in the hydrogen fuel cell space, and they tried to make the point that actually energy usage on a farm is one of the stickiest, hardest to unpick domains because it's underutilized over the year, but it's very spiky, and when you need it, you need a lot of the energy for a certain thing.
Absolutely.
And they were talking about replacing diesel tractors will just take forever, and it's almost nigh on impossible and things. And that was always I didn't lean too far into the hydrogen fuel cell space, but that was their thing, was this could be the only real hope for that as an industry. Do you still follow that space?
So yes is the answer, but they ironically, everything goes in cycles, and so because of my background, I have an interest in all things that are old and vintage and classic associated with agriculture. One of the earliest tractors in production in the 1930s was actually based on a hydrogen fuel cell.
Really?
Alice Chambers tractors. So we think that hydrogen is cutting edge and all of that stuff, but
I didn't know that. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So it just shows you how things, because the technology itself is not particularly complex. The problem is it's really expensive,
dangerous. But farmers don't mind that. So Northern Ireland is an interesting edge case in the energy sector because of the complexities around all the politics and the fact that it's an island and all this. I guess that puts you in a really interesting position from a regulatory grid. Like the grid doesn't care almost. Like, talk us through a little bit of that experience and how, like, when you talk to counterparts in other geographies or legislations, like what's different about your world and what do you think is easier and harder?
Well, I suppose like I started my career from an ESB point of view in Northern Ireland, and I've moved obviously much broader at this stage, but back for the first 7 or 8 years, that's exactly what I did, was worked in the Northern Ireland space. And I kind of like to describe it to people as being a Venn diagram, because from a policy point of view and the kind of the drivers for support schemes and all of that, it all originates, even though it's a devolved nation, that originates in Westminster. So everybody's got one eye on what's happening in London, but then uniquely Northern Ireland is also part of what's called the single electricity market. So the island is treated as one market for electricity. And that means that you have Northern Ireland sitting in the middle, and one part looking towards London and one part looking towards Dublin to see how it works, what best works and all the rest of it. And then beyond that, like Northern Ireland is almost an island within an island, because like geographically it's always been remote from the rest of the island because of just the landscape issues. So it has a self-contained energy network or electricity network inside. Well, pretty much. There are 2 points of connection south of the border, and a third one that's been talked about for all the time that I've been involved in energy and still hasn't happened. And there's a connection from Northern Ireland into Scotland, but to all intents and purposes, it has to be almost managed as a self-contained system, and that makes it tricky. I wouldn't be forgiven if I didn't mention my sister. So she actually works for the system operator in Northern Ireland. She's the director of operations, and it's her job to make sure that the lights stay on in Northern Ireland. Because of that issue with the network and how confined it is, it's really tricky to make sure that there's enough generation available in that part of Ireland.
Yeah, that's really interesting. My co-founder worked on that interconnector you mentioned way back, and he has fond memories of being in Belfast and doing that work. It does beg the question, like, energy security becomes a really difficult thing in a geography like that, in a complex network like that. It must be an unenviable job your sister has to try and kind of balance all the constraints.
I know, no, absolutely. And because I'm involved in renewables, I make her life hell because what we do, what ESB runs wind farms in Northern Ireland. We run a thermal plant in Northern Ireland as well, but we have wind farms. We'd be keen to look at opportunities for offshore in Northern Ireland waters as well. But that just adds to the complication of trying to balance the system. And I think, in fairness to the system operators across both islands, if you like, Ireland and GB, the work that they do to keep the system balanced is to their eternal credit. And Northern Ireland was in the vanguard of the level of integration of renewables on the system. We got to 40% more or more quickly than anybody else did, and that's a significant challenge in the context of trying to keep the system stable.
Yeah, because I guess the smaller you get, the kind of spikier and the more difficult that challenge gets. And huge achievement. Yeah. I think, and it does make me think, it's like you meet younger people now and they don't know what a brownout is or a blackout. Like, it's not a thing that's really part of their world, because actually where we are, we're very fortunate that we do have very stable systems and a lot of hard work's gone into it. And it always makes me laugh when, like, you see the local kind of residents Facebook group and people are talking about something like energy bills, and they're like, "What's a standing charge?" and da da da. You do that. You have to understand how much it costs.
But it's a real challenge for us as a sector as well, because what we are all trying to do is really complex, and the average person walking up and down the street doesn't really understand, and that's good in the sense that when they flick a switch, the lights come on, and that's exactly as it should be. But the work that's required to make sure that that happens is phenomenal, and they try and explain that to people in a way that is engaging and easily understood is not easy either.
Yeah, and I mean, being energy nerds, you just think, why don't you love this as much as I do? Sit and listen again. Let's talk about policy and coordination then. You've been involved in quite a few cross-cutting groups like the Renewables Industry Group. Like, where have you seen those kinds of groups have a real impact and that kind of collaboration make a significant difference?
So I think, I've been lucky because I've worked with, as you say, what it was at the time, the Northern Ireland Renewables Industry Group. I've worked with the Wind Energy Ireland, the equivalent body on the island. I've worked with Renewable UK, I've worked with Scottish Renewables, and they all do a tremendous job from my point of view. And I think the reason that they're successful is because they're seen, rightly so, as a trusted voice from the policymaker point of view. And I think it might be contrary to popular belief, but I genuinely believe that the policymakers are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to make the system work, and so that we have the energy security, we have the relatively low cost, and all the rest of it, and of course the low carbon piece as well. And all of us as developers, I think, struggle to, rightly so, we'll all promote our own projects, so we will say you should do X because X is the right thing for, project Y. And the good thing about the trade associations, the industry associations, is that they will represent the industry in the round, and because they do that, then the governments trust them. And I had really positive experience of that when I was chairman of the Northern Ireland group, where you could see that we were actually making a real difference in the context of some of the stuff to do with renewables back. That was back in the around 2010 time, but so things like planning policy, for example, when it was, I think sometimes people get fixated on a particular guideline. And when I started working in this sector, everybody said, well, the tip height for turbines can't be any more than 125 metres. And you ask people, why 125 metres? And there's no rationale, really. It's just that, and the planners are trying to make sure that they're not too tall and all the rest of it. But whenever you engage with the policymakers and explain to them that, A, it's almost impossible to get machines to meet that spec, and B, if we can put up slightly bigger machines, then you need fewer of them, and that's potentially a less negative impact on the countryside. So that type of engagement really helped and made a difference. And I think the other thing that Northern Ireland was particularly, again, at the forefront was in the context of constraint and curtailment, because of that islanded system that we had, that island within an island, there were projects starting to come online, and because of the level of instantaneous penetration that could be coped with, this notion of projects being turned off because there was just too much energy in the system was very real for us back in, and it's still very real today. But the good thing about the industry groups at that time was that we were able to articulate the reasons that even though projects were being curtailed or constrained, that it was important to keep bringing more projects online, because there was a proposal at one stage to say, right, the ones that are already built, protect them at all costs, and then the ones coming online would have to pick up all the curtailment constraint, and that would have just stopped development. So that's just a couple of examples of how a trade association can make a difference from my point of view.
Yeah, and I've been involved in some of these in GB, and it's like really positive, but very frustrating experience, because you can see the material impact it makes, but it just takes ages, because you've got to get lots of very busy people together. You've got to kind of formulate something quite structured. It needs reviewed. It needs back and forth. And then people, like, I sense myself doing it, the kind of dichotomy of being frustrated with stuff not going quickly enough, but then knowing how long it takes, and like how it's actually just, it takes a long time, because these are complicated things. There's a lot at stake. No one, like, you're never going to get to a solution where everyone's happy. That's unfeasible. So you've got to keep making sort of small steps and make change gradually, I guess. Yeah, it's an interesting space. I've not considered that it's almost like a microcosm. It's another parallel universe in Northern Ireland where you're doing it, but faster and sharper, because it's more constrained and you're a bit further on. The journey's different.
I think one of the sad things for me personally is that, like, I was fortunate to work in Northern Ireland from about 2008 through to 2015ish, and I think that was That was, if you like, the purple patch in terms of delivery of renewables in Northern Ireland. And we've lost our way since then, just in the context of, I think it's part of it's because of the way devolution has worked out. And there's been a view that says, well, look, we've done the heavy lifting, and so the rest of the UK can pick up now. And that was all true, but I think we're now actually losing ground again, and we need to pick up the pace to make it happen again.
That'd be nice, a bit of like actual sort of competitive edge to it, something else to go at each other about. But I can see that. Yeah. So you've had a career pivot from onshore into offshore, and I always think that they couldn't be so dissimilar when you speak to people that have worked in them. It's like, ultimately, it's wind turbines, but that's like almost where it stops. And I'm living in the data layer, like I'm obviously a bit removed. But from your experience then, was it a bit of a shock going into offshore, and what carries over and what doesn't?
That's a really interesting take, Adam, because I would almost have said the opposite.
Really? Okay.
In the sense that, so technology, the broad technology is the same, but for me the challenges are still the same. So whenever I was trying to build an onshore wind farm, I was worried about consent, I was worried about grid, I was worried about route to market, I was worried about energy yield, I was worried about the agreement of the people that owned the land and the communities around where I was trying to work. And I still worry about those things in the context of offshore wind. But you're absolutely right in the sense that it is different. I would say the biggest difference is in terms of scale. Yeah. And that scale in the context of, physical scale and what we're trying to do, and the amount of energy that can be generated and the size of the turbines and all that stuff. But then of course the other issue is the scale in terms of the investment that's required. Yeah. And because the offshore projects are so large compared to a typical onshore project, and because it's more expensive just because you're working in a very harsh environment, then the numbers, that was the thing for me at the time, the numbers were eye-watering. And of course, let's say it's a factor of 100, pick a number, but let's say if it's a factor of 100. So that, the problem, and this is where there is a similarity between an onshore and offshore. In both cases, you invest all the money at the start and then hope you get it back. Right?
In about 4 years.
Yeah. But from an offshore point of view, it's just, it's a complete factor of scale difference in terms of, it could be 100 times more. So I'd say that's been the biggest fundamental difference. The other thing that's different is the complexity, in the sense of we're building a project off the coast of Edinburgh at the minute, Inch Cape, and at the last count there were something in the region of 60 contracts associated with that project. And that wouldn't be typical on an onshore project. In an onshore project, you would have a contract for, the civils works, you'd have a contract for the balance of plant, and you have a contract for the turbines. And then there'd be other ancillary bits around that. But that's, in a sense, that's most of what needs to be done. Whereas offshore, it's just so many contracts, so much complexity. And then, like, I'll always be an engineer, and I'll always be keen to see the big toys and all the rest of it. And just the complexity of what the engineers can deal with, in the sense of, what they can do 50, 55 meters below the level of the seabed, or below the sea level on the seabed, without being able to get there. It blows my mind all the time.
And I think, for me, it's like when we look at and work with offshore developers, it's the amount of money that goes into actually, can we build a wind farm here? Like the big bet and the surveys and stuff is just like really frightening and scary. And the other thing, I think, when I'm talking to like normal people that aren't energy nerds, you see the wind farms often on the horizon out of the sea, and you just think, oh, okay, maybe you've been to Whiteley, or you've seen a great big onshore one. You're like, oh, that's really big. You just cannot fathom how much bigger that one out on the horizon is than the one you've just stood next to.
Well, like, it's this classic Father Ted. Near and far. That's
Father Ted reference, definitely. Yeah. But and like, you see, I saw a video of them constructing like the actual innards of the turbine, and like the tiny little people dotting around in this, like, and you just think, it's mental how big they get. And talking about like constraints, and when you were talking about the regulatory piece as well, it's like we're now bumping into, well, actually, like, it's too heavy for the road. Like, it doesn't matter what you want to do and where you want to do it. The thing's too big and the roads won't. You can't deliver it. So tough luck.
And actually, that's a really useful segue into another difference, because I would say, 75% of the challenges that I would have faced looking after an onshore project was actually getting the kit to the site.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and and because
invariably and community stuff,
and just trying to get around corners and up very narrow roads and all that stuff, because you don't, by definition, you don't build wind farms, on the outskirts, widely excluded, but you don't build them off a motorway. So whereas the good thing about an offshore project is you just load all the stuff onto a ship and then you take it to wherever you need it. So you don't have that kind of logistical piece onshore that you need to worry about from an onshore point of view.
That's where the easy bits end.
Well, that's it. That's it.
What about the kind of soul of ESB? Like, what does ESB do that makes it different? What do you bring that's different to the way you deliver and develop and trade and operate?
Yeah. So I think, and I would say this, wouldn't I? But I would say ESB is a great company to work for. And why is it a great company to work for? I think at heart it's an engineering company.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, I don't actually know the numbers, but I'm guessing there's something like 70% of the people that work in ESB are an engineer of one variety or another. So it's a natural home for engineers. It's actually driven by values. Okay, and I know that's the in vogue thing to stay now. If you're a company, we have, but if there's about 10,000 people that work in ESB, and I would be reasonably confident that if you went and picked one up randomly and asked them, what our 4 values are, they would tell you. And like I had our chief executive in Edinburgh last week, for a visit to the Inch Cape wind farm, and he often says, look, as an organisation, if you have any concerns about what you're doing, just ask yourself the question, what do our values tell us?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really good touch point in the context of saying, is this the right thing to do?
Mm-hmm.
And what that means for me personally is that it means that, so I go home and go to bed at night and I can sleep because I know I haven't done anything that's outside the realms of what aligns with my values and the company values. I think we're financially strong.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's really important to the other part of the organisation, which are the accountants. They invest a lot of time and effort to make sure we're financially strong, but that it's more than a label. Like, we are government owned. We have to be seen to do the right thing from a financial point of view as well. So I think all of those factors contribute to ESB having the culture to be conservatively brave, I would say, is probably the best way to describe it. So we're not reckless, but we definitely try things that take us outside of our comfort zone. And that's why, we only started working in offshore wind in 2017.
Wow.
So and now we have a portfolio. We're involved in a portfolio in the UK of about 7 gigawatts. We don't own all of that because virtually every project that we're involved in is a joint venture with other parties. So that's to me, that's a really good example of says why ESB recognises something that's really important from an energy space point of view, and then gets on and does it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think the values thing is like, can be really cringe, and like a lot of companies, you look at them and it's like you could just word soup, but it leads into I personally do a lot of the kind of strategy consulting piece, helping people figure out, well, what should we do and why should we do it stuff. And I think like even strategy is a dirty word in that everyone says it, no one really knows what it means, and they just kind of strategy. And I think values are the same in that they've kind of been like muddied and murky. But for me, the point of strategy values is that cognitive shortcut. It's that if in doubt, like, this is your safety net. Like, if you behave this way or you do these things, you can't go too far wrong.
It's a test. It's absolutely the test, So if you're trying to figure out, should we invest in another offshore wind farm, or should we build an onshore wind farm, or, should we trade Russian gas?
Yeah.
That type. So if you're having those challenges associated with the organisation, and you go back and say, well, what do our values say? Like, they have real value. They absolutely have real value from my personal perspective.
Yeah, it gives everyone that shared language, and like just stuff goes smoother when everyone's on the same page. And like sometimes it will put people off, and that's okay. I think most companies like to be so beige and bland that like they don't put anyone off, and you end up with beige bland outputs. Whereas if your values, it's not for some people, there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. Fine, it's a different place for you, and that's good. On to projects then, financial strength, doing things interestingly. I mean, in your opinion, what makes an offshore wind bankable, like offshore wind project bankable today? Like, what makes a good project that people should be looking out for?
So by definition, so I'm assuming we're starting on a basis that we have a consent and that we have a grid connection, because if you don't have those two things, you don't have any kind of a project. But assuming that those two are there's a few others. I think like one that strikes me is that, and I actually think is the most important one. So projects are built by people. So if you don't have the right project team together, then you're not going to be able to deliver a project. And having the right team together means, if you excuse the cliche, you have to have the right people on the bus, which also means that if you have the wrong people, you have to get them off the bus as well. So it's a two-way process. But if you get the right people, I think that's the first thing, and that makes a difference, because ultimately you're going to rock up. You're going to rock up to a bank and say, so we want to spend 3 billion on a project, and we want you to give us 2 billion of that. Okay. And they will rightly say, well, why should we give you 2 billion? We're going to give you more than you're going to invest in it yourself. So tell us why. And I think the people and the experience behind the individuals are there. That's one big factor. Like, I think the other thing that's really important in terms of a bankable offshore project is the whole piece around the supply chain, because like, you cannot get to the banks and say, it'll be all right in the night, because we've learned the hard way, to be frank, in terms of, if you don't have the contracts in place for your foundations, if you don't have very solid contracts in place for your turbines, and over the last number of years, if you don't have contracts in place for the people that are actually going to lift and shift that stuff, effectively the vessels and all the rest of it, then the wheels can come off the wagon really quickly. So I think the supply chain piece and having that nailed down is really important. And then the third thing, of course, is the route to market. Because that route to market is critical, particularly for a company like us, because we're about minding our financial strength and making sure that we don't put at risk what effectively is a state resource. The company, we pay a significant dividend to the Irish government every year. So we need to be mindful of that. We need to be guardians of what we do. And currently, a government-backed route to market is still the most secure option for us to bank a project.
There's a lot there. That's like the people piece is interesting, because I don't think there's anything wrong with this, but it makes me think that you basically can't. You need to have the experience in the room. You like a load of grads that are really clever, went to a good uni, couldn't get together and raise the money and do it. They wouldn't have the credibility. You kind of want to see people that have the scars and have the expertise, and even like, okay, not so much just young people, but like a load of tech entrepreneurs come in and just like experienced operators. Would they be able to get that kind of, like, would they pass that test?
So I'm speaking very much from personal experience here, in the sense that, one of our first forays into offshore wind as ESB was alongside EDF in a project called NG. And that was a really challenging project to deliver. It came in late, and cost more money than it should have done. And if someone said to me today, so why did that happen? Like I've said many times to people, so we, as an ESB, we didn't know what we didn't know. Okay. And I know, working on Inch Cape now and working on the projects that are coming down the line, we know a lot more stuff than we did when we started. And we also know the stuff that we don't know and where we need to go and get help for that. So can a bunch of graduates that have graduated with first class honours from University of Glasgow or wherever it happens to be, can they build an offshore wind project? Absolutely, because they have the technical skills and the intelligence and all that stuff to be able to do that. But do they know where the bear traps are? Probably not. Okay, and that's not that different to any other field of work.
Of course.
You need people like myself with grey hair to say, here, just watch out for that one. But that's normal business. I think part of the challenge of offshore wind is it's still a young industry. Like offshore wind is full of people like me who started off on a completely different career path, because when I was a student, the notion of offshore wind didn't really exist.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So when you have a scenario where you're in a relatively young industry, you don't have the academic learning, you don't have the experience of working in other projects. So a lot of people are learning as they go, and the more of that information you can capture at this stage, the better when you go off to start a new project.
I've a better question. Could I go and build an offshore wind farm? Like, would I be bankable? If that was the measure, does the team, could I just go and raise the money and build an offshore wind farm?
So the really interesting thing is, and I'm not going to make any comment about your capabilities.
I've got a couple of grey hairs, more than a couple.
But I think the really interesting thing, so like before I worked for ESB, I would have known them as an entity and said, look, that's a really good company, it's a big company and all the rest of it. We can't build offshore wind farms by ourselves. It's just the scale of the investment.
Yeah, of course.
So we took on to build one average size offshore wind farm today and got it fantastically wrong, it could bankrupt the company.
Yeah.
Okay. So any individual or any kind of startup organization or any of that stuff, my honest view is that that's not where it's at. And sometimes people get frustrated because they say, you're not leaving room for pioneers and all of that good stuff.
Pioneer, right?
But you need money, you need experience, you need the resource behind you, and unfortunately or fortunately that comes from large companies.
What about, so we're in bonny Scotland, what about like Scotland and the wind industry? What are your views on where things are going?
So I had rarely visited, never mind worked in Scotland until 2015. Like for us, coming from Northern Ireland, for us Scotland was somewhere you just drove through when you're going to England. And then I got the opportunity to start working over here in 2015. And I have to say, since 2015, for the last decade, I've just loved the place. I think it's a fantastic place to be. I think it's a really positive place from an energy point of view. I think the mindset is fantastic and all that stuff. And so long may that continue. Scotland has one of the best resources in the world from an offshore and onshore wind point of view. So that makes it really positive. I think the other thing that Scotland is pioneering in many ways. So Scotland from a UK point of view, and some might say from a global point of view, like Scotland has been at the forefront of floating offshore wind, and I would say that they will continue to be. We will continue to be. We have interest in floating offshore wind projects in Scotland, and they will be at the forefront of what happens in the commercialisation of floating offshore wind in the world. I think the other thing Scotland's going to be really important from a global point of view, certainly from a UK point of view, is being able to deliver projects that are farther from shore and also projects that are in deeper water. I think they're setting their stall out. Now they have challenges. Like the biggest single challenge that Scotland has is the grid system, in the sense that actually the physical wires, but also the cost of using that system to export electricity. So again, I think the future is bright for Scotland from an energy point of view, but there's work that needs to be done to make sure that it can actually deliver this full potential.
It's palpable, the thing you're talking about there, like all of it, the pros and the cons, like you can feel it in the air here when people talk about energy, and it's a good, passionate place. It's very exciting living in Edinburgh and working in Glasgow, that it attracts so many people to come and live here for this. Like actually a lot of English accents in Edinburgh are doing exactly this, like they're coming to be in the energy space and make a big difference, and it shows that it's drawing talent in for something good. like an interesting way to spend a career, like doing good stuff.
And we shouldn't forget, the transition that people have been making from oil and gas into the offshore sector as well has been really important. The number, so that really interesting engineering stuff that I'm talking about in terms of what the guys can do offshore, like that has all come from the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, of course.
They have pioneered that, and they're making that transition from a lot of them are from oil and gas. Now, oil and gas is very fickle. The times we're currently living, it suddenly makes sense to produce as much oil and gas as you possibly can. But, in 3 years again, who knows where it'll be. So I think the renewable sector from a Scottish point of view is a much more stable platform from a national point of view, but also from a jobs and roles point of view in the context of, it doesn't have the boom and bust nature. I don't think that the oil and gas sector can.
Yeah, I think that's wholeheartedly true, because you kind of you're not transporting something that is easily transported around the world on ships, and there's centralized incentivization to kind of make this happen and go a certain way. We just opened our Aberdeen office, so we're very familiar with people that are making their way over to the renewables industry from oil and gas, and there's so many great people up there that are just hungry to keep going and doing interesting things. So it's an exciting space to see how it changes. And again, if you're into big toys and big pieces of kit, it's a great industry to be adjacent to. We talked about supply chain a little bit. Is it keeping pace with what we need? Like, do you feel that the supply chain is becoming more stable in this space?
The supply chain piece, I think, is really interesting from my point of view, because if you talk to any government, so you talk to the Irish government, you talk to the Scottish government, you talk to the guys in Westminster, they all say, we want to see local content, and we want to build a turbine factory in wherever, Dundee, or we want to build a cables factory, or we want to build jackets in Belfast, or whatever it happens to be. It might be controversial, it might be the wrong thing to say, but in some ways I think that's kind of past the post for us, in the sense that there are other people that have been doing that for a long time that can do it more cheaply than we can do it, and they just have the kind of infrastructure that they need to deliver that stuff, and therefore I think we've kind of missed the boat in that sense of trying to build turbines or jackets or whatever it is that we have. But I've seen really good examples in Scotland and elsewhere of companies that have identified a niche in the supply chain and saying, we can do that, and they do that really well, and they make good money at it because it's a value added service that they provide. It's not about hammering out a piece of steel and doing it for the cheapest that they possibly can do. Like from a Scotland point of view, there's companies there like I always talk about Briggs Marine, who did work for us on NNG, a company of about 1,000 people based on the Firth, the Firth of Forth. And if someone says to me, what do Briggs Marine do? And I say, I'll tell you what they do. They come along and they ask you, what's your problem? And then we'll fix it for you. And that's kind of what they do. And because they do that, so they supply vessels, they provide engineering scopes, they fix broken pieces of kit. They do all sorts of stuff. And they have figured out that they're in a niche that they can provide that service, that there's not too many others that are doing that. There's another company called ESB Energy, who again originated in the oil and gas sector, and they're now doing a load of work on the offshore side. They're working for us on Inch Cape. Again, similar scenario whereby it's a group of individuals who figured out there's a gap in the market here, and they're filling it. Another really good technology company in Ireland is a company called Exocean, who make autonomous vessels for survey work. And again, the people behind that said, there's nobody doing this well, and we can do it. They actually came from a wave and tidal company. That's where they started off from, and that became difficult for them. But in terms of the work that they had to do for that wave and tidal work, they saw there's actually no one can get the information that we need quickly and cheaply, and so they went off to do that themselves, and they've been working all over the world doing that. So for me, for the supply chain from a UK and Ireland point of view, it's about innovation. It's about figuring out what's needed and providing it to the development companies, as opposed to trying to say, we can make a foundation 5% cheaper than those guys can do it for.
I wholeheartely agree. And like you've touched on, so we know Exocean very well. Recently announced AWS pioneers in their space. AWS, Amazon Web Services, have recently announced that Exocean are one of their big leading pioneers in some of the sort of digitization and forward-looking use cases. And it touches right into that value add piece. And I guess where we live is that, like, what's your view on digitization and the impact AI and data can have on what the next 10 to 20 years of this industry might look like?
So for me, looking specifically at the offshore side, and there's no reason why it can't happen onshore as well, but looking specifically at the offshore side, like the big challenge for us is going to be around making what we do as safe as we possibly can. And one of the things that you can do to make the job safe is to stop putting people offshore. Okay. And I think, things like improved connectivity to the turbines, better AI systems, use of remotely operated, whether it's vessels or submarine vehicles or drones, all of those things can hopefully help fix some of the problems that we're likely to see on turbines over the next 25, 30 years and avoid the risk of putting a young man or a young woman on that jacket, on that foundation, because it's not an easy working environment, and it can be a dangerous working environment. So anything we can do to reduce that level of risk, and of course doing that reduces the cost as well. So that's where I personally see the main use for the kind of the tech frontier in terms of sorting out what I do in my day-to-day job.
It's amazing. We really, I'll plug ourselves for change, but we recently won Scottish Enterprise funding to do a feasibility study on marine mammal observation and invasive surveys. So can we help some of these autonomous survey companies like Exocean look at detecting fishing line and like leftover debris in the water, pods of mammals and things like that, because some of the regulation at the moment mandates that it needs to be a human on the boat that does that. And can we prove that you can get equivalent or better results in a kind of semi-remote setup? Because for exactly that reason, okay, the regulation says one thing, but can we change it? Can we prove that it's changeable and without any harm to the environment? I'd say it's often my wife's an ecologist, so like under no circumstance am I here thinking, it doesn't matter. Quite the opposite. Can we do a better job in a safe way that scales, reduces the cost, and makes this easier for everyone?
Like in fairness to the health and safety sector, have moved from being a sector that's about you shall and you shall not, and the barrier needs to be 1.2 meters and blah, blah. So they have moved from that kind of regulation space to say, you do a proper risk assessment, and if you can convince us that the risk assessment means what you're doing is safe, then do that. And that's exactly the same thing in the context of the environmental monitor. So it's not about setting the regulations and setting the rules. It's actually about assessing the risk and making sure that you don't overstep the risk. And if you can do it in a different way, fantastic.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. So before I let you go, any hot takes or controversial opinions? Any like sort of juicy goss or heard it here first that we could share?
I would say, and again, it could be slightly controversial, but I think like we've had the fortunate experience of being involved in building Inch Cape at the minute. Like every single piece of metal that has come to that project has come from China in terms of the foundation structure. They have delivered on time, on budget, really high quality, really good safety record. So it possibly has helped us is that we're actually working alongside Red Rock Renewables, who are a Chinese company, and maybe that's had an impact on that. But it certainly demonstrated to me what China can do. I think it's only a matter of time before Chinese turbines start to appear in the market for UK projects, and I think that'll have a complete disruptor effect in the context of where the industry goes. Because, speaking very frankly, we don't have enough competition in the turbine space at the minute to build an offshore wind farm. There's 2-3 suppliers, and they're kind of at capacity, so it's a seller's market from their point of view, and it's I think it's hampering the competition a wee bit. So, but if we see competition come from China, then that'll disrupt the whole market space.
That's a good one. That's one of the better hot take moments we've had. I mean, look, we've seen exactly that play out in BES, where like everyone and their dog is now buying Chinese batteries because, yeah, exactly the same thing, on time, affordable, quality's high, like tick, 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 tick. So, yeah, very interesting.
Like geopolitically, it's difficult,
Of course.
But I think, like ultimately, if you take it at face value, the quality of what comes across is second to none, I would say.
Yeah, you can't spin up a turbine factory in 6 months, right? Like it takes some time, and that's a significant investment.
And I think sometimes we forget that China is the biggest offshore wind market in the world. So it's not as if they're going to send us over something that has never been built or tried or tested. They're all there operating in that market space. So, and ultimately, we'll get what we pay for in the context of, if we want a particular quality and a particular standard and warranty and all the rest of it, then we'll get it.
Very good. Okay. Well, what's next for ESB in the sector?
So one of the things for ESB is, I told you where heritage came from. We'll be 100 years old next year as an organisation. We started off as a renewables company. So in 1927, the first kind of national electricity generation in Ireland came from a big hydro scheme in the country. Ironically, built by a visionary Irishman with a load of help from Siemens in Germany.
Really?
In 1927. And those turbines, those hydro turbines from Siemens are still there generating electricity today. Yeah. So we're very focused on where we came from, what we're about, and we are very focused from an Irish point of view in terms of delivering energy. And as our chief executive has said in the past, there's never been a significant change in Irish energy policy that ESB hasn't been at the heart of.
Yeah.
And I think the next one for us now is going to be offshore wind. And that's part of the reason that I'm over in Scotland and England doing offshore wind, is to make sure that we can get the scars on our back, as we were talking about earlier on, and then take them back and deliver. So literally just before Christmas, we secured a site called Tonua off the southeast coast of Ireland. So I would say that's going to be one of the very early offshore wind farms in Ireland, and ESB is going to be right behind that. So I think that there'll be a focus on that now for the next 5, 6, 7 years to actually make sure that happens.
Very cool.
And in the meantime, we're still continuing to deliver projects on this side of the water as well.
Yeah, very smart. Look, this has been amazing. I mean, before we let anyone go, I always like to ask the question, if there's anything you'd like to promote or plug, or if people in the audience want to find out more about you or ESB, where should we point them?
So the simplest place is the website. I always laugh to myself because when I came to work in Scotland initially, and I told people it was from ESB, I might as well have been telling them I came from ABC because it meant nothing to them. But ESB stands for the Electricity Supply Board. It's quite unusual actually, because it's an organisation that has been set up by an active government in Ireland. So sometimes it causes confusion whenever we're trying to get funding and stuff, because they say, show me your company registration, and we go, well, funny you should ask. But the good thing about it is that, so it's very easy to find out about ESB. It's esb.ie. Everything that they need to know. Like, I suppose we're not in the business of selling stuff in the sense of what, some of your other clients and other contributors will be. All we want to do is make sure that we deliver energy to Irish consumers and actually British consumers for the best cost that we absolutely can for them. So you'll find, if you go into our website, you'll find ways through to your electricity supply companies and so on. But that's my job, is to make the electricity, not to sell it.
Cool. Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us here in Glasgow.
You're welcome.
And we look forward to seeing you over the waters in months to come.
Thanks a million.
Thank you once again for listening to the Hypercube Energy Podcast. As always, if you have any feedback or comments, or you want to get involved, please get in touch. And if you want to find out more about what's happening in data and AI across the energy sector, please join the Beyond Energy community. And I look forward to speaking to you soon.